Fishing for a killer, the murder of Matthew Margolies 1984. 13-year-old Matthew Margolies adored his grandfather. After Matthew's parents divorced in 1984, the two would go fishing together nearly every day at the Byram River or Parkway Lake in Greenwich, Connecticut. Matthew even called his grandfather Dad and wanted to be a firefighter just like him. They were inseparable. Matthew did not have much contact with his own father, Paul, a corporate executive living in Texas. Matthew and his older sister, 19-year-old Stacy, lived with their mother in a white, two-story clapboard house on Pilgrim Drive in a modest neighborhood. The house sat on a hill overlooking the Byram River. Their mother, Mary Ann, was a nurse, and Matthew often stayed with her parents, Stella and George Miazga, who lived a few blocks away on Morgan Avenue. He even planted tomatoes and corn in their garden. When George Miazga was diagnosed with a terminal illness in the summer of 1984, a devastated but attentive Matthew made sure that his grandfather took his medication and ate and drank properly. Miazga died on August 17. To help him through his grief, Stella gave him her husband's fishing rod and the rest of his gear. 2 weeks later, the quiet, dark-haired boy was sleeping over at his grandmother's house when Mary Ann phoned to say goodnight. "I love you," she said. It would be her last words to him. August 31, 1984, was the beginning of the final weekend before 8th grade began, and Matthew decided to indulge in his passion that Labor Day weekend. He laced up his black and white checkered sneakers, grabbed his rod and fishing tackle, and headed toward the Byram River. On his way, Matthew stopped into a deli in the neighborhood to buy some milk and a Danish on which to snack. Then he went down to the river for the morning. Just before noon, he returned to his grandmother's house and placed his catch, a large trout, in her kitchen sink. He took off his soaking wet corduroy pants and draped them over a chair in the living room to dry. He changed into a pair of shorts and left again. Stella returned home at noon, but her grandson was already gone. He was still out when she left the house at about 4 p.m. to run errands before dinner. A neighbor saw Matthew at about 5 p.m. He was walking towards the Byram River with his fishing pole. He was last seen fishing from the Calmly Avenue Bridge near the deli. It was one of his favorite places to fish, and other boys were with him. Stella Miazga and Mary Ann Margolies began to worry when Matthew didn't come home for dinner that night. It was unusual for him because he would always let them know where he was. Mary Ann drove around the neighborhood looking for him. At 7 p.m. she contacted police to report that her 13-year-old son was missing. Officers arrived at her house to gather information, but they were not terribly concerned. Matthew was devastated about his grandfather's recent death and was probably hiding somewhere, they speculated. Mary Ann pointed out that he always phoned if he planned to be late, and left notes whenever he went out. It was not like him to just disappear. The police suggested that Mary Ann Margolies search by the river with her son's dog Freckles, shouting, "It's okay, Matthew. You're not in trouble. Just come out and show me where you are." She knew that it was pointless, but she did it anyway out of desperation. They told her to call them again if he still had not turned up. Later that night, detectives began to take Matthew's disappearance more seriously and launched a search. Police and volunteers scoured a 3-mile stretch of river extensively, but turned up no sign of him. Divers went into the river to see if he had drowned, and helicopters flew overhead hoping to spot a hint of his whereabouts. 2 days later, police called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation for help. The extensive search dragged on, led by officers in the Youth Division rather than detectives with experience conducting murder investigations. On September 5, 5 days after Matthew disappeared, volunteer searcher Fred Lambert found a pair of black and white checkered sneakers on an isolated ridge near the top of a heavily wooded ravine at about 3 p.m. Matthew had asked his mother about that very spot when they were driving by a week earlier. It was where mill workers once lived, she had explained. She also told him not to go there by himself. Mary Ann Margolies told police about the spot when she contacted them about Matthew's disappearance, but much time would pass before anyone checked it out for signs of her son. It was located more than a mile from his home. Lambert picked up one of the sneakers and brought it to show police. 2 officers immediately accompanied him back to the spot where he had found it. An hour later, they discovered the decomposing body of a teenage boy buried nearby in a shallow and hastily dug grave. It was covered with leaves and rocks. They were almost certain that it was Matthew Margolies. He was wearing a white t-shirt and underwear. His athletic shorts were lying near his body, but there was no sign of sexual assault. He had died of multiple stab wounds to the neck, chest, and abdomen and what State Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Dr. H. Wayne Carver II called traumatic asphyxia. He had suffocated to death during this brutal attack after his killer had stuffed sticks and dirt in his throat while he was still alive. But it was clear from cuts on Matthew's arms that he had tried to fight off his attacker. Fear spread throughout the community. Parents began picking up their children from school, even the older ones, and would not let them go outside alone. They would also keep a wary eye out for strangers wandering their streets. At Western Junior High School, teachers set up a buddy system. Students were paired up and instructed to phone their buddy in the morning if they were not coming to school. To ensure their safety, school officials planned to call the homes of any students who had not arrived and were not accounted for. Otherwise, if kids disappeared between home and school, parents might not know until the evening. Teachers also discussed with students precautions about dealing with strangers. The murder reminded residents of the then unsolved murder of 15-year-old Martha Margolies. On October 31, 1975, her badly beaten body was found near her home in the Bellhaven section of Greenwich. She had been beaten to death with a golf club. The police department was criticized for its investigation of the case. It would take more than 25 years for her killer to be found. In 2002, neighbor Michael Skakel, a member of the Kennedy clan, was convicted of her murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Still stinging from the criticism of the way they handled the Margolies case, the Greenwich Police Department was careful about the way that they collected and looked after the evidence at the Margolies crime scene. The slope where his body was found was sealed off, and the scene was photographed from different angles. They searched the area for evidence, and then they began removing the leaves, branches, and rocks that covered the shallow grave. Some rocks were as much as 3 feet long and weighed more than 100 pounds. Matthew's body was carefully lifted out of the shallow grave and taken to the morgue. After his remains were removed, officers found the murder weapon that had been left behind. It was a 10.5-inch boning knife. Despite the careful work of police officers, they could find no clues pointing to Matthew's killer, no witnesses, and no obvious motive. The hot and rainy weather had affected the crime scene by the time it was finally located. Although Matthew's shorts had been removed, he had not been molested, but the brutality of his murder led investigators to theorize that he had been humiliated and tortured and that had been the goal of his killer. A woman who lived in the area told detectives that she had heard someone screaming at around 6 p.m. the night that Matthew went missing. 10 detectives worked on the case, interviewing more than 1,000 people for possible leads. FBI profiler John Douglas said that the killer was likely a white male who lived nearby, knew Matthew, and was aware that he went fishing almost every day. Police now had the murder weapon and other evidence from the crime scene as well as clues regarding the type of suspect they were looking for. Police interviewed potential suspects, including local sex offenders, a teenage bully who lived near the crime scene, and a boy who claimed that he had bought Matthew's fishing rod from him for $2. Police spent 3 hours interviewing the bully, who had had encounters with Matthew. Investigators learned nothing new, and they did not find anything in a search of his home. The time card from the restaurant where he worked indicated that he had been on shift from 4 p.m. to 10:40 p.m., the time during which Matthew Margolies had been murdered. There was nothing linking him to the crime. A few weeks after the murder, a maintenance worker at Grand Central Terminal in New York found a suitcase full of newspaper clippings about Matthew's murder. The police wondered if it was the killer's souvenir of the murder that he had committed, but investigators traced the suitcase's owner to Matthew's neighborhood. The man was a commuter, and his wife had collected the articles as reference material for a safety project that she was working on as a school volunteer. 9 months after the murder, the investigation was down to 3 detectives and no new leads. In 2000, the Connecticut State Police's Cold Case Squad took over the investigation. They had helped solve the decades-old 1975 murder of Martha Margolies. Biological materials from the Margolies crime scene had been carefully preserved, in an era before DNA evidence was used to help solve crimes. Connecticut Governor John G. Rowland increased the reward for information leading to an arrest in the case to $50,000. The result of a DNA test that was conducted on a possible suspect was negative. Investigators also followed up on the possibility that former Port Chester police officer Roger Kenneth Bates may have been involved in Matthew's murder. He was a detective in Greenwich from 1975 to 1985, and he was later convicted of molesting a 14-year-old boy in Texas. One of Matthew's childhood friends said that Bates had molested him in 1984, and the man had also once taken the 2 boys fishing in 1984. A strong connection could not be established, however, and a request in 2006 for a grand jury to indict Bates failed. A plaque in Matthew's memory was placed beside one of his favorite fishing spots on the Byram River. It reads, "Matthew Margolies, an excellent angler, and now with God 1971 to 1984. Although Marianne Margolies has since remarried, she chose to keep the family name that she shared with her son. It is a constant reminder to people in her community that Matthew's killer is still at large.